Let's talk about cosmetic formula phases and how you know what phases to create and which ingredient goes into each phase. This is a question I have gotten a lot, like within the past couple weeks. And it's a question that I have gotten like a lot in the past, but I don't know, all of a sudden everybody has been asking me this question, and I never planned on doing a video on this because there's not a simple answer to this question. There's a lot of different variables that go into this, and it might be kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to do the best that I can to explain it to you guys. This is what a formula looks like, and as you can see, it's broken up into multiple different phases. So why do we do this? First off, we might do it because some of the ingredients are oil soluble and some are water soluble. We may also do it because some are heat sensitive, some aren't heat sensitive. Sometimes we need to dissolve a powder, so it needs to go in a different phase first in order to dissolve it before being mixed in with everything else. There's also times where an ingredient just works best when it's mixed with something else first. So those two ingredients need mixed together first before doing everything else. Here's an example. This is an emulsion formula. Emulsions are things like hair conditioners, lotions, face lotions, moisturizers, creams. Those are emulsions. And we need to break it up into multiple different phases: the water phase, the oil phase, and the cool down phase. So we have to separate the oil soluble ingredients and the water soluble ingredients and heat them up separately. And we do this because we have to melt down our emulsifier. And our emulsifier is oil soluble, so we mix it in with all the other oil soluble ingredients to make sure everything is around the same temperature. We also have to go ahead and heat up our water soluble ingredients as well to make sure they are warm as well, so we can mix the two together to create an emulsion. If you have a hot oil phase and then mix it into a cold water phase, it won't work out. So that's why we separate the two, heat them both up, and then mix them together. If you just mix them all together and heat them up, you won't be able to fully dissolve your oil soluble ingredients, and things just get a little bit messier that way. Now, there are exceptions where there are like cold emulsifiers that you don't need to heat them up. That's not what we're talking about. This is why we have the two different phases for an emulsion. We have to heat them up separate. But then we have the cool down phase because we might be working with some heat sensitive ingredients. So we have to add those in at the end. So sometimes it's a little difficult to know if an ingredient is oil or water soluble. I mean, most of the time we know like almond oil is oil soluble, or shea butter is oil soluble, or lavender hydrosol is water soluble. Those ones are pretty simple, but it can get a bit trickier when you're working with more advanced ingredients or like actives or something. But you can find that information in the formulating guidelines. So any cosmetic supplier that sells cosmetic grade ingredients should be providing you with the formulating guidelines for that ingredient. And you can find those on the listing page for that ingredient. There should be tons of information provided to you there. And if the supplier doesn't provide the information there, I would message them and they can probably provide you with a PDF file or something of more information. And sometimes on that product listing page, you might have to click on a PDF file for the formulating guidelines. Sometimes they're hidden in there. But in there, you can find so much information about that ingredient and how to formulate with it, including if it's water or oil soluble. You can also figure out if the ingredient is heat sensitive or not. That way you know if it needs to go in the cool down phase or not. And they even sometimes provide advice on what it needs to be mixed with. Okay, here's an example of not really having enough information, but just a little bit. So this is PEG 150 distearate. And it does offer a good amount of information. Under use, you can see that it tells you to heat it up. When incorporating it into formulas, it gives you a usage rate, but it doesn't really explain to you like what we should be mixing it with or what phase it should go into. But if you look under documents, you can see they offer an example recipe. This is a really good way to learn how to work with ingredients if the supplier provides some example recipes. If you look under phase B, you can clearly tell this is the surfactant phase since it does contain two cleansing agents, which are surfactants. And you can also see PEG 150 distearate is in phase B. And if you look down at the bottom to method, you can see that it says heat phase B to 150 degrees Fahrenheit and melt the ingredients. So we know that you have to heat the PEG 150 distearate to melt it, and then you just combine phase A and B together. And that's actually how I figured out how to work with it. That's how I learned that the PEG 150 distearate needs to go in the surfactant phase and then needs to be heated. So this is why I'm always telling you guys, read the formulating guidelines. This is how I learn most of what I know, is just reading the formulating guidelines. I take what I learned there and then I experiment with it. So in case your supplier doesn't have any formulating guidelines, or maybe they do and they're just not very helpful. For example, this salicylic acid from Making Cosmetics, they provide formulating guidelines, but if you follow this information, it doesn't actually work out. So when something like this happens, I just search the internet for any scraps of information I can find. Where I normally start is I'll search something like how to formulate with salicylic acid and just go through anything I can find and just document all the information I find. Whether it's actually accurate or not, I document it all. Another thing I do is I'll Google how to formulate with salicylic acid, or I'll just put like salicylic acid and then put Chemist Corner. This is a website. I don't honestly know like if it's like really that active anymore, because it seems like most of the posts I see are pretty outdated. But this is a place where formulators can post questions on a forum, and then other people can just come across and comment and offer their advice. And a lot of times this information is outdated. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, but either way, it's still helpful. And I just document all the information I can find and then go into my lab and do experimenting and try to figure it out. It may take a lot of time and a lot of failures and wasted ingredients, but normally I can figure it out. So that's what I recommend doing if your ingredient doesn't offer formulating guidelines. And you just have to like experiment by adding your ingredients into different phases to see how it works. So another way to look at the phases is kind of like as steps that need done first. So xanthan gum is an ingredient that performs best when mixed with glycerin. So anytime I use xanthan gum in a formula, it's always in its own separate phase. And this is called a slurry. I do the same thing with hyaluronic acid. And hyaluronic acid and xanthan gum both perform best when you create a slurry by mixing it with glycerin first. I normally use like 3 to 5%. Just depends on how much you're using in your formula. You just really need enough to, get the powder mixed in. You don't need too much. So they always perform best when mixed with glycerin and then adding the water into it. This helps the hyaluronic acid or the xanthan gum hydrate in the water much faster. They both have a tendency to clump up in water, and the glycerin helps prevent that, although you'll still probably get some clumps, but they hydrate faster. So if you have an ingredient that you realize works best when mixed with something else first, that's when you'll have a separate phase. So I think I've actually already discussed everything in this video that I wanted to discuss, and it actually went a lot faster than I figured. So let me just kind of go over everything super quickly. You'll have different phases because these phases are basically steps you need to take. In a formula like this, your first step would be to mix the glycerin and xanthan gum together. So that's why it's in a separate phase. And then the next phase would be mixing all the water-soluble ingredients together. And you have this phase separate because you need to dissolve the DL-panthenol because it is a powder. So you want to dissolve that DL-panthenol before adding the water-soluble ingredients in with the xanthan gum and glycerin, because it'll thicken and the powder won't dissolve as fast once it's thickened. So that's why you want to have a separate phase for the water-soluble ingredients to help dissolve the DL-panthenol. If the DL-panthenol wasn't in the formula or no other powder ingredients, you wouldn't have to worry about that. But since it's there, you got to add it there. And then that means you can go ahead and mix the water phase with the slurry, xanthan gum, and glycerin. So then why do we have a separate phase for the surfactants? This is because the surfactants do have a little bit of a viscosity to them. And if you mix that in with the water phase, again, the DL-panthenol may not dissolve as well. It might, but it just dissolves easier just mixing it in with the water first. So then just mix the DL-panthenol with the water till it dissolves. Add that into the xanthan gum slurry, and then you would add your surfactants. Or for an emulsion, you would have a separate phase for the water-soluble ingredients and oil-soluble ingredients, and then heat-sensitive ingredients. That's why you have separate phases. This just creates a stable emulsion, and then the cool down phase makes sure that none of your heat-sensitive ingredients are disrupted and lose their properties. Or if you're like working with a solubilizer, so you can mix like 1% essential oil in with some water for like a body spray or something, you have to mix that oil with a solubilizer first. If you just mix everything together directly into a beaker with the water, it won't work. The solubilizer has to be mixed in with the essential oil. And again, you can find all of this information on the formulating guidelines for your ingredients. Read all of that. If it doesn't offer that information, Google it, add Chemist's Corner at the end on your Google search, and just read any information you can find and then just like add all the information together. Like that's how I like to do it. It's like a little scavenger hunt. But yeah, so let me know if you have any other questions like this you would like to see me make a video on. It's funny because this question seems pretty like simple to me because I've been doing it for so many years, but I totally get how somebody who's a beginner wouldn't understand. And honestly, if you don't have the right phases and your ingredients in the right phases when you're making something, sometimes your product can completely fail, and just moving ingredients around to a different phase could completely change the outcome of your formula. Also, don't always assume something is water soluble or oil soluble. Sometimes you would be really surprised by an ingredient and its solubility. So yeah. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Later.
In the motions, I've been consumed by the wrath of time. Like I'm frozen, I'm shattered in this life. It's still the path that I've chosen, because I've had a vision. Now I'm on a mission to find myself with music and find someone to listen.